Hi, my name's Jessica Stewart and I'm Head of Sustainability and Community Development at Ginninderry. You're with us today on the Ginninderry Inspire podcast, where we get to talk to experts and visionaries about how we can inspire a new way of living for a brighter future. I would like to start by acknowledging the country that we're recording on today. We are so privileged to be able to live, work and learn on lands that the First Nations people have had connections with for many, many thousands of years, and we honour their ongoing custodianship. Today, I'm joined by my colleague Tom Gray, who is Ginninderry's Art and Cultural Planning Advisor. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you, Jess.
So tell us a little bit about your role at Ginninderry and what you do.
Look, I'm a consultant with Ginninderry, and my main role, well, it's got three arms, I think. Firstly, the link and looking after the link exhibition space.
Okay, and the link is our community centre and our project office down at Strathnairn here in Canberra.
That's right, and it's a building that really will transition to community ownership and as part of Strathnairn Arts.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful space as well, and because we do sit on the Strathnairn Arts Association's land, that ability to include artwork is really important. So how do you see art fitting within the link? Is it just exhibition space or are there sculptures?
Well, in the short term, and I guess that goes to the other parts of my role a little bit, but in the first instance, we inherited, of course, an exhibition space as part of Link, which I think is fantastic, especially as with more of a community arts focus, which I guess makes it a little bit different to Strathnairn Arts and their focus on professional artists.
Yeah, wonderful. And other parts of your role, I suppose, as we create the actual urban space of Ginninderry is to think about public art. Tell us about how you think public art should be included in Ginninderry and in new communities.
Yeah, sure. I'm very lucky, I guess, in that I've been involved in public art for a very long time now, and it's given me a lot of time to think about what public art is, and that's changed and evolved over a long time, I think. But public art certainly is important, very important, I think, as a part of placemaking. It's very closely related, of course, as well to what people call interpretation, the way stories are told through signage, directions, colours, the forms of places as they get developed, the landscape architects, the natural environment, and the cultural history and significantly, of course, First Nations cultural history.
Yeah, and you've got some incredible First Nations artworks here with us today. You want to tell us a bit about them?
Yeah, sure. So I completed a Masters actually in public art about 10 years ago, I guess now, and or more like 15 actually.
You don't look a day over.
And I had roles both in Melbourne and then in Darwin, working with landscape architects with a public art focus. So I was invited up to Darwin to work with the landscape architect with a major project being a major development of a motorway interchange, which effectively became a gateway, if you like, to Darwin with an alternative, more direct road route. Right. And it was, as a lot of these gateways are, a spaghetti of roads overlapping each other into large bridges, pedestrian bridge, and a lot of other landscape treatments along the way.
And probably a lot of grey and a lot of concrete, I'd imagine.
A lot of grey, a lot of concrete, a lot of planting, and a lot of landscape architects were certainly using endemic plants in a really beautiful ways. There was a lot of cycads, for example, that had been moved or repositioned on site and so on. So some beautiful planting, but there was a large public art component, and they were looking for, firstly, I guess, a curatorial method for how that might happen. But secondly, after I think a few hiccups of choosing an artist and then an artist actually presenting works that were not going to work in that road environment, they're actually, if you looked at them, they could easily be mistaken for warning signals for roads.
Right.
So there was sort of a problem there that needed to be overcome in terms of finding a new way forward with this project.
Yeah.
So the artworks I've got here are artworks by a group I got to know really well in my 5 years or so in Darwin, and that was a group called Larrakia Nation.
Wonderful. For those of you listening to us on the podcast, you can take a look at these artworks on our Ginninderry social media pages on Facebook and Instagram. And you can also view this whole recording of the podcast on our Ginninderry YouTube channel as well. But just to describe it here, they're kind of like a 10 centimetre by 10 centimetre square with some beautiful Indigenous artworks on them of, it looks like some sort of shellfish or cray, some other things as well. Yeah,
that's right. So what transpired was that I talked with this group of Larrakia Nation artists, and we talked. Realising that there's a way forward, perhaps, of using the kinds of works they're already using, the kinds of works they're already doing in printmaking, in this fantastic little, very small, very messy studio they had. But it was a fantastic kind of environment of working together, of collaborative working, or as we said before, colluding. So we, together with them, developed a bit of a theme for what this opportunity with these gateway bridges was. And one of the key themes that came out was it's a transition point from saltwater country and freshwater country. It's a transition point to come into the Larrakia country. And so these big bridges, one bridge became a focus for the freshwater as you entered in, and then you came through to the saltwater. So what we see here is we see the prawns, and we see the bamboo. So the bamboo being, or not the bamboo, sorry, the pandanus. The more freshwater things, including the ants and the seasonal things as well.
Okay.
So there was also a season. There were 6 seasons in the Larrakia calendar, and we became focused on one of those seasons as well. Yeah,
and I'd imagine having the Larrakia Nation involved in creating these artworks gave them more of a sense of belonging and a sense of being able to be part of something a road system, which would normally be quite a different kind of method.
Yeah, that's right. It was much more, I guess, much more down to earth than I had experienced, certainly in the projects I had worked in Melbourne, where I'd worked for a big multidisciplinary international firm where everything was, I guess, over-designed. This gave a great opportunity to print out large drawings of the bridges themselves and sit there with texters drawing on these bridges and actually making it up as we go.
Yeah. And you did find quite a different, a different wanting, I suppose, of bringing in locals in the Northern Territory than you saw in Melbourne, or was that? And is I suppose is there a difference for Canberra as well in terms of the public art that you see here?
I think one of the key things that in that 5 years I was there, and perhaps I was just very lucky to meet this great group of artists and get to work with them on a number of different projects. But it was a real sense that with Larrakia Arts, and that said, it did help that there was an organisation with a venue, with a place, with a workshop to go and talk to them and work with them. Yeah. But it was a great. It felt like we needed to put these stamps into the landscape, these reminders, and repeated reminders that Larrakia needed that, and the city also needed that.
Yeah, and I mean, art is such a great way of telling stories without it having to be a book that sits on a shelf or an oral history. They can send a message to a 2-year-old or an 82-year-old, right?
That's right.
And looking at some of the things that you talk about in I was doing a bit of Googling of you last night, but you talk about art needing, I think, to be multidisciplinary and talk to more than one people. Can you talk about that in terms of particularly that need for public art?
Well, I was very lucky, and I think it's part of this podcast to talk a little bit about the public art strategy. It was great to help with Talitha, the community development manager, who's no longer there, but to talk with her about how are we going to bring this strategy together? How are we going to bring a public art strategy, which we've drafted at the moment, and how do we get a diversity of approaches to public art? But because public art is definitely not just a commissioned piece in the landscape.
Yeah.
It can be all sorts of things. It can be performative. It can be temporary. It can have a medium-term kind of idea that might be like street art or something like that, or it might be considered more permanent in the landscape. But there's just so many ways in. So talking about the typology, what kind of result might come out of it, but also the methodology, what are the different methods that might come about, and that both those things can be thought of as completely different journeys, even though the outcomes might look kind of similar in a typology.
Yeah, and I think even as I was thinking about public art, the first thing that pops into my head are the big sculptures like the Belko Owl, or the large-scale street murals like we have down here in Braddon. And I think that piece around actually art can be everywhere, or it can be anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be static. It can be either dynamic and moving, like some of the artworks around the Canberra airport, or it can actually physically be temporal and move. I think is really important, and I think it really does shift your thinking about what is art.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was another thing I was going to bring in today, a book by Richard Long, who I remember a student way back when I was doing my TAFE course in arts, my first visual arts course, gave to me, and it may or may not have been stolen from the library, but the library was later demolished and well appreciated.
Well used and appreciated.
But what I really like about his artworks in the public sense is that the artwork may be told in a gallery situation, and often is, but it tells of a journey that was done in public. So, for example, there's an artwork where he did a multi-day trek across Japan, and he took one object from one place to another, and the translation was really just what object he had picked up and exchanged it for on this journey across Japan. Okay. So you've instantly got this, not just the text on the walls that actually goes in a path, in a similar path to what he may have taken, but you've got this clear representation of a performance in public space. And
so was he swapping that item as he went?
So
building community in itself by having those conversations and
that's right. But also a deep understanding of place, of just picking up these natural, it might be a stick, it might be a shell. Yeah. And there's all sorts of other ways. There's another one he has done, for example, which is a perfect circle around London. And when you look closely, you see that there's lots of little jagged edges around that circle. And you realise that circle was a path that he walked.
Right.
And that the performance was walking this circle.
Yeah, and I think I've seen another image of his as well, which is literally a straight path through the middle of a paddock, right? And talking about, I suppose, desire lines and people creating their own impact
That's right.
on a place.
Yeah, I think line made by walking. Yes.
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right. Yeah.
So I think all of that's really, really great. So in terms of then how, art is quite subjective.
Oh, of course.
And how do you know when you're designing a public art, how do you know that you're designing something good or that is interesting? Or don't you know?
I think you don't know, and I think that there's definitely place for more play. I think, obviously, when things can generate a conversation, and sometimes that can be a negative conversation, and that's something that's well known in the public art. That things can be analysed, and then they might be moved to a different location because people are really unhappy with those things. But I think I used to be more fussy about the results in public art than I am now. Now I feel that it's more important that the play is there, that the action is there, and there will be good public artworks, fantastic public artworks that will be designed with amazing foresight and telling incredible stories. But there'll also be lots of opportunities. The more opportunities we have for that play, I think, the more placemaking we're going to be doing, the more understanding of that place, both environmentally and culturally, will happen if there is a more open conversation.
Yeah, so moving away from that sort of curated piece of art that, I suppose, talk about plonkism, right? That is
right.
sort of added into a space nearly as an artificial thing to fill a space, but rather maybe letting that space
that's
be.
right. So when I did my Masters, there was a lot of conversation around docklands in Melbourne.
Right.
That was my Masters in public art.
Yep.
And I see now that the conversation continues, that, what went wrong in docklands with both the development but also the way that initial public art was the approach that they took, which was to commission great artists. And there's some great artworks there. And I think I'm sure it's been debated way beyond its needs, and the place, I'm sure, has evolved a lot since then because it's 20 years old now.
Yeah.
But the conversation around having the different typologies, I think, is one way to ensure against some of those kinds of mistakes where the community didn't really understand what was happening in their environment. The artists weren't necessarily connected to the community, and the artworks they might have had fantastic contemporary ideas, but they didn't sit in a landscape design that really worked for them.
So you touched briefly on Ginninderry's art and public place strategy.
Yep.
So how are you thinking that we should include public art into Ginninderry differently than other places have?
Well, I'm glad to say it's already happening, I think.
Great.
I think that, for example, the way that Ginninderry works with the Conservation Trust means that we have a greater connection to the natural environment immediately with that strong relationship. But also working, obviously, with the cultures that are moving into the Ginninderry, and the diversity of those cultures, but also always and trying to reinforce that recognition as First Nations country.
Yeah, and one thing that pops to my mind, I suppose, is our design libraries that we have. You talk about those and what you see their use is over time.
Yeah, look, so the design libraries being a set of commissions of 5 First Nations artists and 3 other artists who are connected to the local region, and there is a great library of artworks that Ginninderry had the foresight to commission, and I really do see great opportunities to think about these artworks, sure, in their direct sense, but maybe having a look at them as well in the way that landscape plans might come about, for example, because so many, especially of the First Nations art, artists are looking from above at the topography of the landscape, of the shapes of the rivers, of the rocks, and so on. So and some of the artworks are all around water and sparkling light, the origin of the name Ginninderry.
Yeah.
So I think there's fantastic opportunities to actually enlarge these artworks to a grand scale, perhaps, that might be just in the shapes of planting beds. It might be in the physical paths that are made.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I brought along these drawings as well, because these were translated and enlarged significantly. And, I'm talking 100 metres by 8 metres high.
Wow. Wow.
So and they were stamped into concrete in various collages and so on. So there's really great ways that we can think about using this design library, I think.
Yeah, and even in the first suburb of Ginninderry, which is Strathnan, our landscape architects have done things like put the Ginninderry logos into some of the concrete paving. If you do look from above at Treadwell Street, you'll see some of that coming through there as well.
Yeah, that's right.
The first sculpture that was done by G.W. Botts actually put some of her glyphs carved into the rocks that surround that work. So it's about not only looking at the big picture component, but then also these smaller pieces, or being able to have those different kinds of perspectives to really look at. If you're looking from above or looking right up close,
that's
I
right.
think is really important.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And are there other things that we need to be thinking about designing into these spaces for viewing?
Definitely. And that's, I think that part of that comes down to ideas of place and placemaking. And one aspect of public art is, of course, performance. But there's also other people who talk about placemaking in the way that we become the performers when we design places.
Right.
So, and making these kinds of venues that maybe that interaction creates in its own sense, a sense of performance that you may not realise or may not realise you're actually a part of.
Yeah. So I know it's like trying to pick a favourite child, and we know that we don't want to do that ever, but is there an actual place somewhere in the world that you think of that really triggers you as a place that's done placemaking and public art really well? And then after you've told us about that one, can you also tell us about a place that you think could really use some public art?
Yeah, look, there's so many places I think of, and I feel very lucky that I've been to some places that I've walked out after a late night's arrival into a tiny square in Sicily and been overwhelmed by the amazing kind of place and heritage of such places. And it strikes me again, yes, there's art in that. Of course, there's lots of art, but so much of it is also just great architecture and great materiality.
And colour and light.
That's right. And also the performances that we were talking about before, the performances of the people who are in those places. But the other thing I can't help but say is when I did my Masters of Public Art, the conversation was really urban. And I had to be honest with everyone to say that I actually spent my weekends rock climbing in natural places. And I think it came together once when I was hanging off a rock in Arapiles in the middle of nowhere. I looked down and someone had written words with the rocks at the bottom of the mountain. Yeah. The words were Save Pines Laneway or something like that. Pines Laneway was just a path between tents.
Wow.
Because there were so many people camped climbing over that weekend. So it was someone making a comment about urban design in the most incredible place. And I was like, wow, we're really invested in this, aren't we?
Yeah.
That people would do such a thing.
Yeah.
And it was great. It was lovely to sort of take this photo of my climbing shoes and this void, and maybe 100 metres below this message in the rocks.
Wow, and it really shows then that wilderness can be art.
That's right.
And our modification of those spaces to both show that we value it, but also to create images.
Yeah, and I think that's where I guess maybe I'm a bit different, but my academic interest was really in this idea of more than human public space, more than human public places, the way that we walk through that place, but also the way that the plants and animals we live with exist in those places as well.
And it changes not only our moods, but I'd imagine their quality of life as well.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's a really nice one to round out this conversation, I think, as well, is that really all of the places that we are building and designing and using every day should be places for people,
that's right,
for play and for performance.
Yeah.
And I think it's really the ability that art has to really start to think about that creative touch of all of us as humans lets us really dive into something that is quite unique and creative for us.
And there's such great opportunities, yeah.
Wonderful. Tom, it's been so interesting talking to you today. I have definitely learned a lot, even though that we've been colleagues for many years. I don't think I'll look at a public artwork or even a place that I'm walking in the same way. So thank you for all of your insights. And thank you to everyone that's been listening to us on the podcast today. If you'd like to find out more about Tom's work, our public art strategy at Ginninderry, you can find links to those on our show notes, or better yet, actually come out and see us at Ginninderry and visit some of the areas and spaces that we're creating. If you've been listening on the podcast and you'd like to actually see us in person and the Larrakia Nation's artworks that Tom has brought in with him, you can do that through our video version of this podcast on YouTube. You can also hear and contribute to creating a brighter future for your community by subscribing to the Inspire podcast and visiting our website, ginninderry.com. I'm Jessica Stewart. Have a lovely day.